One of the biggest local election issues: how do we improve education, and which school board candidates will do the best job for our kids? Then, how will the county balance the ever-expanding metro area with the goal to protect the environment? And this year's election from the perspective of a reporter who covers national security. This is Metro Week. The November election includes races for seats on 5 Pima County School District boards, plus the county school superintendent's race. We'll sort through the big issues in the campaigns after the week's news.
Nearly a quarter of all Pima County voters who asked for early ballots have already returned them. More than 71,000 people have voted in the county and returned their ballots. Those ballots were mailed to voters last week. They can be mailed back in the next 2 weeks or dropped off at polling places on Election Day, November 8th. Voters can still request early ballots on the county recorder's website or by phone. The recorder's office reports 500,000 Pima County residents are registered to vote, and more than 350,000 requested early ballots. Nearly $500,000 has flowed into Arizona TV stations in the last few days as the presidential campaign reaches a fever pitch. Stations in the Tucson area received about $200,000 in pro-Hillary Clinton ads this week. The Stop Hillary PAC spent nearly $300,000 this week on a statewide ad buy. Big-name surrogates for Clinton have been in the state this week, including Bernie Sanders, Chelsea Clinton, and Michelle Obama. So far, Donald Trump has not purchased more ad time in Tucson, nor have plans been announced for another visit from the Republican nominee. Investors are returning to the Tucson real estate market. Numbers from Adam Data Solutions show large investment groups are responsible for nearly 3% of home purchases so far in 2016. That's 60% growth in the past year. This time around, investors are looking for rental income instead of aiming to sell for a profit. For more on the week's stories, visit our website.
Outside the spotlight of presidential and congressional races for the November election are the contests for school boards and the Pima County School Superintendent. We'll start with the superintendent's race for an open seat. The county school superintendent monitors district budgets, oversees school board elections, fills school board vacancies, and other duties. The job is an administrative arm of state government. 2 mathematics teachers are seeking the seat. Democrat Dustin Williams teaches 6th grade in the Tucson Unified School District. Margaret Burkholder is a middle school teacher at La Paloma Academy. They met in a forum last month and described what they consider to be the biggest challenge for the job.
I think the greatest challenge in education is teacher retention and recruitment. And part of that has to do with the salaries that teachers are receiving. So there's definitely some advocacy that has to happen in this community for teachers and for parents to ensure that we have the best teachers in front of our kids. So I think that's the huge part. And if I'm going to have a platform, it's the best teacher in every classroom. And parents have that opportunity. I don't care what neighborhood you live in, what community you live in, every child should have access to the best teacher. So how are we supporting those teachers? And as a teacher mentor and as a teacher myself, I thoroughly understand the issues that teachers see in the classroom, and we need to work with those teachers to ensure that they have the support that they need, not only financially, because they want to be able to support their families, but also with discipline. And so one of the roles that the county school superintendent can do is to advocate for teachers for those areas.
Obviously, the biggest drawback that we have right now is since 2008, the Arizona legislature has cut over $1 billion in public education. That's $1 billion. We have a problem with our legislature not doing what the Arizona Constitution says they need to be doing, which is fund public education. The average salary right now for a teacher is $31,000 a year. Okay? I make about $37,900 a year with all the credentials that I have. Right now, we have 62% of our districts have reported that we have vacancies. 1 in 5 teachers right now leave mid-year. Okay? These are statistics from the National Education Association. These are facts. The problem right here that we have is when the superintendents are getting together, and they're advocating at the state level, it's falling on deaf ears. We have a lobbyist that is hired, that we pay for. That lobbyist needs to be doing something a little bit stronger or needs a little bit more help. That's what I look to come and do.
Joining me are the two education reporters at the Arizona Daily Star, Yu-Hyun Jung and Alexis Wicochea. And Alexis, I'm going to start with the superintendent's race that we just heard about. Both candidates seem to support a lot of the same ideals and goals. So does the difference really just come down to sort of their background and experience?
I think so. I think voters will definitely take those things into consideration, given that they do tend to agree so much on a lot of the major education issues. You have Margaret Burkholder, who has served as a governing board member for the Vail School District for 12 years. So she does have that elected office experience. Dustin Williams does not have that elected office experience. He's never held one, but he has said that he's been gearing up for quite some time now and basically acting as if he has held that office. But I think something we've learned in this election year is that with voters, some really value that experience and others really welcome the idea of a newcomer. So it'll be interesting to see which way they go with that. But I think either way, it'll be interesting to see what direction the office has gone in, given that we've had the same county school superintendent for the last 2 decades.
Now, you've also covered the race in Tucson's largest school district, which is Tucson Unified School District. And there's 7 candidates seeking, is it 3 seats on that board this election? So what's the likelihood, I know the big conversation is whether the board majority will change. What's the likelihood of that?
So we've had this group of 5 board members in place since 2013, and the community had the opportunity to change the board in 2014, but the 2 incumbents who were up for election at that time won back their seats, so they decided to retain them and keep the same board. This year, like you said, there are 3 seats, and 2 of those seats are held by members of the majority. They are Crystal Foster and Cam Wattis. And then the 3rd seat is occupied by Mark Stegeman, who is part of the board minority. If all 3 were to change, that could in effect change the entire board majority. Even if one of the incumbents fails to get reelected, we have the very real possibility of the dynamic of that board changing.
There are 17 school districts in Pima County, 9 in the metro area, but only 5 have elections, right? Mm-hmm. Why don't we see every school board having elections this year?
That's because 12 races have been canceled because there was not enough competition. So there were as many vacancies as people running for those vacancies. So only in 5 races we are seeing some sort of competitiveness.
Now, what are the biggest issues in the districts that you've been covering on the school boards?
In the districts that I cover, candidates have been basically very unified in what they think the issues are in education, and those issues that candidates have mentioned in those races that are competitive are teacher retention and recruitment, which is a huge problem in Arizona and around the country, actually, and also funding or lack thereof.
So how much ability does a board member have, these candidates who are running, if they win, to actually have any impact on the state budget process, the state deciding how much money the district gets?
Governing board members do not have the authority to boost or reduce state funding. That power comes from the state. But what they can do is have some input on how that money gets allocated.
Inside the school district?
Yes.
Okay. Are they just talking about this as a big issue, or are people actually talking about finite spending decisions on the campaign trail?
So some candidates have actually talked about redistributing resources and also seeing where cuts can be made to support more classroom functions. But other candidates have also talked about boosting the lobbying power of school districts to the state legislature so that funding could increase.
Now, you've both covered the issue of teacher pay and retention. So most of the districts used the infusion of new money from the Proposition 123 that voters passed in May for teacher raises. So what's the discussion about how to keep supporting teachers and keep adding to the pay? Alexis?
I think the commitment has been to continue to use those Prop 123 dollars to boost teacher pay each year. I think at this point in the school year, that's not really a discussion that's being had. That's something that more often tends to be discussed in the spring when they're determining how they're going to allocate their budget for the following school year. But they have indeed made that commitment to continue using that money. Some school districts say that they're continuing to work to cut back as much as they can away from the classroom so that they can continue to find a way to boost that pay even further. So it's really just a matter of seeing how true school districts stay to that commitment of continuing to allocate those dollars to teacher pay.
And how does that all play into the question of retaining good teachers in these districts?
Well, teacher shortage is directly tied to funding because the teacher pay is not so great in Arizona compared to other states. We're basically always ranking at the bottom of any education metric. So in that sense, Prop 123 money would help with teachers getting some raises, but also at the same time, what we need to consider is the various propositions that school districts have put out this election. So they do want money to repair their buildings and get new technology, and also continue their overrides. Vail, Continental Elementary, and Marana districts are seeking an override for classroom-related expenses, which is part of the maintenance and operations budget. And Amphitheater School District is seeking a $58 million bonds, and that would support capital purchases. And lastly, Sahuarita District wants a $25 million bond and the lesser of a $1 million or 10% district additional assistance override, which is capital funding.
And all of these are increases in the property taxes that people who live in the district would pay if they
those are
approve
tax
them.
levies to the districts.
Yuhyun, Alexis, thank you so much. Pima County approved a plan this week that would balance land development with environmental conservation. It applies to 44 species, and the plan was decades in the making. In 1998, the community was first grappling with this issue, and Arizona Illustrated covered the controversy of the pygmy owl. Here's an excerpt of that debate, which led to the plan approved this week.
The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service defines prime habitat for the pygmy owl as land below 4,000 feet and areas with saguaro cactus, ironwood, mesquite, or palo verde trees. Based on that description, 100 square miles of Pima County includes prime pygmy owl habitat. The Board of Supervisors passed a host of recommendations today, hoping to protect the endangered birds and the county from potential liability. From now on, anyone seeking to rezone an area for development in prime owl habitat must survey the property for owls. The requirement does not include parcels of land that are 3.3 acres or less, but some environmentalists wanted the requirement to go further.
The Fish and Wildlife Service has noted that while pygmy owls do exist in these lots, there have been vast expanses of undisturbed, undeveloped habitat adjacent to the suburban ranch lots where owls are known to inhabit. So a sea of houses dotting the valley on every 3.3 acres will not secure the survival and recovery of the species.
Supervisor Ray Carroll represents the area of the county where pygmy owls have been spotted.
There are going to be some places that are obviously not going to make it past the phase one if you include just an overall survey. I'm worried about the bottom line cost of the surveys if we can break them into 3 or 2 sections at least for the less in depth and then the more complex of surveys, if you understand what I'm saying.
Executive Vice President for the Southern Arizona Home Builders Association, Alan Lurie, unsuccessfully tried to persuade the board to hold off on its rezoning requirement.
There's still going to be development, there's still going to be people buying homes, but they're going to be spending more money for those homes.
Tucson developer Richard Genzer holds a different opinion. He spoke at a recent forum on the owl sponsored by the Udall Foundation.
As the population grows, as we move out into the hinterlands, as we bump up against everything that we love, that we're going to have to accept the circumstances. And that might be that if there's an endangered species there, then we can only build X units versus Y units, or maybe we can't build at all. And these are things people should take into consideration. I mean, ignorance of the law is no excuse.
During its meeting, the supervisors also recommended to work with local, state, and federal agencies on a regional conservation plan. The plan would seek to prevent some of the problems which surfaced when the pygmy owl was placed on the endangered species list last March.
This new multi-species conservation plan grew out of a concern for balancing development with pygmy owl habitat. The plan protects species such as the leopard frog, various bats, the Pima pineapple cactus, the Sonoran desert tortoise, and a raptor called Swainson's hawk. Some of the 44 species are federally recognized as threatened or endangered, and some aren't yet. Last week, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service signed on to the plan.
that's really what it was all about, was how to develop a blueprint for how Pima County could develop into the future and be what they wanted to be, and still have this beautiful desert that we have here.
Effective conservation happens at the local level. It's conceived at the local level, it's embraced at the local level, and it's implemented at the local level. That's how conservation happens. What you have developed here will benefit future generations for many, many years to come, and it'll benefit people as well as species. The old, one-off, you protect one species, you do good things for one species. That's not the way of the future. The way of the future is this landscape-level conservation, and you guys are on the forefront.
Pima County's Director of Sustainability, Conservation, and Historic Preservation is Linda Mayrow. She worked on that plan for 18 years and joins us for more. Let's get at the heart of this. How does the plan balance development and species conservation?
That was the goal from the beginning when the no-growth wars were at their worst. So the goal was always, how do we balance conservation in this wonderful environment we live in, and how do we ensure the economic well-being? So with everyone yelling at each other for a very long time, and then the pygmy owl was listed in 1997, the County Board of Supervisors basically directed staff to find a solution. So what we did is brought all the stakeholders together, and it was the environmental community, ranchers, developers, property rights activists, environmental activists, and we asked them to, try to help find a solution together. So what they did was start a conversation, and those reasonable people among them sat together for 2 years to find this conservation goal, or to realize the goal through hearing each other and then saying we can accommodate growth and we can accommodate landscape level conservation. So in the end, that's really how we do that. The environmental community, of course, wanted species protection. The environmental community was heard. The developers said, we need certainty, we need protection, we need to be able to go on with our business. And the county was saying, we have to build roads, schools had to build schools. So people sat down together and said, what are the important values in this community? And people really value the environment, and they value economic well-being. And so what we did is the science team came up with plans for how to acquire sufficient landscape level protections for many species while allowing growth to occur in areas that were not as sensitive.
You referenced landscape level protection, and so did the Fish and Wildlife Service representatives. What does that mean, landscape level protection, and how does it differ?
Without this sort of approach where we take the big view, how does the whole ecological system work together, it would be project by project mitigation, which is a patchwork quilt. And, the conservation plan, the Sonoran Desert Conservation Plan, really grew out of finding what are those values to our community to seek that solution of balance.
I want to ask about the Rosemont mine. That's an area where we have a lot of environmental concerns bucking up against a lot of business concerns, wanting to operate that mine. How would this work in that scenario?
Actually, this plan will not benefit Rosemont at all because it does not cover federal actions or federal lands. So Rosemont is responsible for its own mitigation.
Okay. So then another example, say a housing development on the southeast side or southwest side.
If it's in unincorporated Pima County, I want to just say that, this gives the developer certainty that he can move forward without an individual consultation with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service as to whether endangered species occur on his land. What we will do is, now that we have about 240,000 acres in our mitigation land bank, if you will, that will protect these species. So when a developer comes forward, he will, let's assume he impacts 100 acres, we will deduct that acreage out of our mitigation bank, and that will be applied towards species conservation, up to 44 potential listed species.
So is it kind of a trade-off? If we build here, then we conserve some land over here, and the
Precisely.
species still have habitat.
And where the county's advantaged already is that voters approved many millions of dollars in land conservation in 2004 and in other years. And so we've been able to create that mitigation land bank now, and we can deduct from it as development occurs, up to 36,000 acres of development.
You mentioned that a developer would not then personally have to go to the federal government for clearance. So this sort of enables the county to act as the go-between or the approval?
Yes, I mean, now that we have our Section 10 permit, we can offer that coverage to a developer on a voluntary basis if he chooses to take it or not. And we will cover him and his development, and it basically saves time, it saves money, and the same is true for county's projects.
For those of us who already have a home in the area and aren't developers of land, what does this mean?
Well, in the 2004 bond election, you've already invested in our open space acquisition program, and chances are you probably voted for it because more than 2/3 of the electorate voted in support of our open space bonds. And so there's an investment made by the entire community to preserve what's important about our natural areas, our ranch lands, our mountain parks, our riparian areas, our historic sites, and that benefits the entire community.
Those bond elections are then property taxes that anybody who rents or owns property pays.
That's correct, yes.
So this is a plan that's balancing development interests and environmental interests. Does it end up being better for one or the other?
I think everyone wins, frankly. Early on we recognized the ranching community and the ranch lands were key to the success of this plan, and so every stakeholder really wins in this process.
Thank you so much, Linda. It's an era of increasing scrutiny and criticism of journalism, and this year's election has raised new issues such as Russian hacking into the U.S. election systems. While those might not seem like local issues, they are in the spotlight here this week. The University of Arizona School of Journalism honors Washington Post reporter Dana Priest with its Zanger Award. The honor goes to journalists who fight for freedom of the press. Dana Priest won a Pulitzer Prize in 2006 for stories on counterintelligence and secret CIA prisons in the War on Terror. She won another Pulitzer in 2008 for her coverage of how wounded veterans were treated at Walter Reed Army Medical Center. She turned some of her work into 2 best-selling books. Her latest work is covering Russian attempts to hack into the U.S. election systems and the impact on the presidential race. Priest has worked at the Washington Post since 1986. Dana Priest is here in the studio with me. Thanks so much for coming in. You know, in this week's presidential debate, the candidates were asked questions about Russia espionage and hacking, and that's what you've been covering for the last few months. But I feel like things get a little oversimplified when we hear about them in those sound bites. So what does the public really need to know about what's going on?
I would say, first of all, that there's a lot that has nothing to do with politics. The most important things have nothing to do with politics when it deals with Russia. For the first time in our history, there's been a foreign power that has tried to influence the campaign. You know, people can debate to what end. Is it pro-Trump? Is it just trying to create havoc? And they've done that by hacking into the Democratic National Committee and some Democratic leaders of that committee, and then distributing what they found, probably through WikiLeaks. The intelligence community, which is made up of 17 different intelligence agencies, concluded, after really not wanting to talk about it in public, but they finally were sort of pushed by, I think, reporters who were finding out that the hack was Russian. They were finally pushed to say that they did assess that the hacking, breaking in and stealing files from the Democratic National Committee computer system was Russian. It wasn't just Russian hackers sitting somewhere in the world, but it was Russia. And
the government. The
government of Russia, which means Vladimir Putin, who is a competitor of the United States, who has very different interests in a lot of parts of the world than the United States. So that's the very first thing. This has never happened before. It's been done by Russia, who's not a friend, It's been used publicly to either weaken the faith in the electoral process or perhaps to sway voters away from the Democrats. It's hard to tell. But on top of that, you do have one of the candidates, Donald Trump, who has an affinity for Vladimir Putin and for things Russian, which he doesn't put in a big context of geopolitical politics as many Republicans would. I mean, he likes Vladimir Putin because he's a strong man, doesn't necessarily link that to the fact that being a strong man in Russia is an anti-democratic move on Putin's part. And he has refused numerous times to say that he understands the seriousness of Russia hacking into an American computer system during an election time, and refused to say that Russia's interests don't always align with ours. He's been given lots of opportunities in interviews, but his main point is usually that Russia is stronger than the United States. And by stronger, I think that I would interpret that to mean that Vladimir Putin has a control of power that's much stronger than President Obama, and that is largely because Russia is reverted back to a non-democratic state where he now controls the media. He puts opposition figures in jail. Many people who are opposition end up dead. It's a kleptocracy assessed by many people, by many experts. There are people around Vladimir Putin who really get to steal the public money and use it for their benefit.
Let me ask you for a little bit of context also. In terms of the election cycle, is it clear from your reporting what the Russian interest is?
So I'll rely on what the intelligence folks have said to me. And that is, I would say that nobody's exactly clear on that, whether or not they actually would like to have Donald Trump be the president, or would they just like to destabilize the United States' backing for its own electoral system, and therefore destabilize the United States and its in the politics of it. I think that most people would go towards that end, that it's not necessarily Donald Trump, it's this destabilization, trying to cause havoc among Americans vis-a-vis their trust in the government. And then on top of that, you do have one candidate saying the election is rigged without even having the election taking place yet. So it's these multi-layers, but if you try to strip out the politics, I guess the other big thing is that the intelligence community now believes that Russia is engaged in a covert influence campaign here in the United States, which is pretty remarkable. They've done that in Europe to try to push rightist candidates, anti-immigrant candidates, candidates that favor Russian points of view in the world, foreign affairs in Syria and that sort of thing. But so now they're using that template to try to influence things in the United States, and hacking is just one part of that.
How does all of this and the campaign itself affect public trust in journalism?
Oh, that's a good question. The campaign has been so divisive. I'm hoping, though, that I don't cover politics, so those of us who really covered the intelligence world and law enforcement are still trying to just cover that, and hopefully, it does get through to people that we're trying to do an honest job that is not political by any nature. I think it's been more difficult now because you have because Donald Trump has said that we're very political, and I totally disagree with that. I don't think he's ever shown any evidence to that fact. I don't think we've been good at standing up for ourselves because it's just not something we usually do. He's tossed the Washington Post out of his rallies when he hasn't liked our coverage, but he's never actually said there's something wrong with the coverage other than it's scandalous and not correct.
So what's the status? Is the Post still
think the Post-
not in those rallies?
No, I think the Post got back in, so did a number of others, but that doesn't matter at all about, we can still continue our coverage. It's not based just on the rallies. We've done a lot of investigative work about Donald Trump's background and his charities and all this sort of thing. So those public events are not important for our journalism.
Dana Priest, thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
That's it for us. Next week, we'll meet a new face in downtown redevelopment. Thanks for watching.